our session with DynamicsCon. We are so excited to be here. Today, our session that we have for you is the top 6 lessons that we learned implementing permissions in Business Central. Some of them we learned the hard way, and we want to share these all with you so that you don't have to learn these the hard way like we did. My name is Cari Corozza, and I am a functional consultant with Newview Strategies. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer with my expertise in Excel. I love Excel, and I am a CPA. So as you've probably guessed by now, I'm a little bit of an accounting nerd. So I really enjoy anything accounting and finance related in NAV and Business Central. And one of the things that I really enjoy, especially working with finance users, is kind of showing them why the system is doing what it's doing. A lot of times people think, oh, the system is not working, but really, usually it is working. It's just a matter of us figuring out how the system works and figuring out what we need to do to be able to do our jobs effectively. So I am here with my partner in crime today, Cynthia Priebe. So I will hand it over to her after I just give another big thank you to DynamicsCon. We love being here and being a part of this. So Cynthia?
Yes, and I'm also with Newview Strategies, a certified trainer and a BC functional consultant. As all our team is, we all have our MB 800 certification, which was fun when we all got it. We could all celebrate. And I've been using Business Central or NAV since 2005. And Cari, you stole a little bit of my thunder because I wanted to also say that I love it when I get to work with frustrated users. And when we're done, they have a big smile on their face. They started saying, I can't believe we bought this system. It doesn't work right for us. How can anybody use this? Well, the challenge is there's typically more than one way to do things in Business Central. And it's just a matter of finding the right way to do that work. And then you're happy.
So Cynthia, that's probably why you and I make such a good team, is because we love seeing that same result when working with people.
Agreed. But I am not an accounting nerd, just so you know.
You know a lot more than you think you do. All right. So our main learning objective for today really is just one. We want to make sure that all of you out there have the tools for a well-planned, organized, and successful permissions implementation with minimal chaos. So as we go through each of our 6 lessons learned today, we'd love to have comments in the Q&A or questions that we can kind of interact and answer at the end of the session. So as things pop into your head, just go ahead and put those in the chat or in the Q&A.
Great. And hopefully we will have lots of questions, right?
I hope so.
We're going to start off this whole session with a question. Why worry about permissions in the first place? Why can't I just let everybody have access to everything? Well, one of the main reasons would be to prevent fraud, to only give users access to what they should have access to. And if you're a small company and thinking, oh, well, we're a small company, fraud's not going to happen here, we're all like family. Well, guess what? It occurs as frequently in smaller companies as it does in larger companies. Now let's talk about some of the numbers. And this is from the CPA Practice Advisor. And they've indicated from their research that most fraudulent employees are caught the first time, which tells me they're probably not very good at it. But I really think it's because it's a crime of opportunity. These are genuinely good people who just find themselves in a situation because they've been allowed to be there to commit this fraud. And if we set up permissions or restrictions and security so that individuals aren't in that situation, they're not going to commit that fraud. On average, it takes 18 months to find the fraud. And that doesn't mean that that fraud is a one-time occurrence. It might be occurring repeatedly throughout those 18 months. And the next statistic kind of supports that because the average financial loss for each incident of fraud is $140,000. That means a lot to a small company, maybe not quite as much to a large company, but that's nothing to sneeze at when you consider that 45% of the organizations are not going to recover that amount of money. It's pretty scary.
Cynthia, and I'm a numbers person, and I bet you a lot of people listening are too, so you've already convinced me with these numbers here that yes, permissions are important.
Good. So now that we know that, why they're important, why they're needed, let's get started with our checklist. Number 1, Don't use out of the box D365 permission sets or D365 user groups. We don't want to do it. But let me explain to you what permission sets and user groups are if all of this is new to you. Permission sets are collections of objects. It's basically a place where we get to indicate what somebody is allowed to do. So for example, the customer card would be the customer table as the object. Are they allowed to read or view the customer card? Are they allowed to create a new customer? Are they allowed to modify an existing customer? Are they allowed to delete that customer? That's what the table data objects are. And table data objects are just one of the types of objects that we put in permission sets. We have several other objects, and we're not going to go into the detail of what all of those are at this point, but those are giving permission to execute. So for example, running a report object, or another object might be posting, being allowed to post something. So all of these objects and what you're allowed to do with them come together to create the permission set and creates a collection. Now, user groups are just collections of permission sets. So once I thought of it this way, it all started making sense, and it was easier to explain to users why and how we need to go about creating these permission sets and user groups. So again, the permission sets are collections of the objects, and the user groups are collections of the permission sets. Now, I can have a permission set that I've created, one of those collections, and I can assign it to more than one user group. So operations might need to have that permission set, and maybe finance needs to have that same permission set. I don't have to create two permission sets. I can assign that single permission set to each one of those user groups. Now, I can also assign permission sets individually to a user, not through a user group. Although we recommend that you keep that to a minimum because it creates more management that's needed. So if you can, create collections of your permission sets and user groups and assign those user groups to the users.
Cynthia, I love the way that you lay out that visual. I think it really helps to kind of map out what's happening in each of those cases.
Good. I'm glad, because trying to have this conversation in the past without those visuals was difficult many times. Now, here's an example of a permission set that's provided for us, and it's one of those D365 permission sets that we're telling you not to use. It's accounts payable. So if I have an accounts payable person, I'm going to assign this permission set to them. However, I'm going to tell you you shouldn't. And the reason is because this is what Microsoft sees that an accounts payable person might need permission to. And one of those is the sales line. Now, if I'm doing drop shipping, my accounts payable person is going to need access to the sales line. However, if I'm not, do I want my accounts payable person to be able to go in and add a new sales line to a document, be able to modify an existing sales line, or even delete it? Why would I want them to have these permissions? I don't. So that's why we're trying to say we don't want to assign these, because they can provide too much access for your business model. It's not the only challenge that we have with permission sets. We have the fact that they provide too much access, but we also have the problem where when it comes to assigning permissions, in a lot of organizations, it's seen as an IT related function. So the IT person, the IT manager is told to create the permission sets, go ahead and assign the permissions, but they don't know what everybody does. So they do that work, they assign the permission sets, and then the first day that everybody's working with those permission sets, they get permission errors. And so then the IT guy goes, oh my gosh, I can't have work stop, so I'm going to make that person a super user. I'm going to do that temporarily until we get through the challenge. But then what we do is we forget. So now all of a sudden we have all kinds of people as super users. Or even worse yet, we didn't even try to solve this permission project and set up these permissions to secure our system, and we just made everybody a super user.
And
OMG.
Cynthia, I know that you have sometimes in the past compared this to Oprah, where it's like you get super and you get super. Everyone gets super.
Exactly. And it's interesting when I do have classes or sessions about this, the number of hands that are raised. I'd be curious if everybody could put in chat whether or not they actually have assigned permissions So just say assigned, or if all of your users are what you would call super users, so you haven't assigned permissions. And by the way, if you have any other questions, go ahead and put them in the chat because we'll talk about it in our Q&A, live Q&A afterwards.
Or if you don't know if permissions in any sort have been added, you don't know how they're in there right now, just go ahead and say too that you're not sure.
Unknown, exactly.
So Cynthia, you just told us not to use the out-of-the-box D365 permission sets and user groups. So that means that we have to create our own, right?
Exactly.
Well,
Exactly.
so let's look at a few different ways that we can go about creating these different permission sets. The first way, we could copy that existing D365 permission set and modify it. We could take that one that Cynthia just showed us, and we could maybe do our best guess at what we should take away and add. Okay, all right. Cynthia's stopping me before I even get all the way through that one, so I guess she doesn't like that approach. All right, what else could we do? Let's see. We could create a blank permission set, and then we could just manually add the permissions. Again, kind of guess at what we think what's going to be needed for that user to be able to perform their tasks. Okay, all right. Well, here's our third way, and I hope this is the right one because this is the last option we have. We could create a blank permission set, and we could use something in Business Central called the permissions recorder.
Woo, 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 woo.
Yay, okay, so much excitement over there.
It's about time, Cari.
I got the right answer. So before we go into this quick demo video, I just want everyone to put in chat or the Q&A, if you have heard of or used the permissions recorder before, just say, yes, I've heard of it. Yes, I've used it. If you haven't, and this is your first time seeing it, go ahead and put that in there as well, because we always like to see if people are familiar with it. And the first time that we show this and demo it, people get so excited about it because they know it's going to save them work. So let's take a look at what we do. There's a permission set that I've created, and I'm going to go to permissions on it. Now keep in mind, right now this permission set is blank. There's nothing in here, because what I want to do is I want to record what I'm going to be doing, the task in Business Central. So I'm going to go to this start button. This will start my recording, and I say, yes, I do want to start the recording. And now this next step is very important. You cannot back out or close out of this permissions window or the recording will not work. So we want to go to tell me to access the page that we need to go to perform the task.
That's one of the things we learned the hard way.
Yes. I'm going to go to purchase invoices, and I'm just going to do something very simple for this. I'm going to create a new purchase invoice, and I'm going to assign a vendor to it. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to back all the way out of my windows until I get back to that original screen with that permissions recorder on it. So here, don't go too far back or you won't be able to keep your recording. Now I'm going to hit stop, and when I hit stop, I have the option to add the recorded permissions, which in this case I do want to do, but if you've made a mistake or forgotten something, you can always click no. And multiple recordings can also be done if you need to append to this. Now let's take a look. We have a whole lot of stuff in this list. We have table data with some yes, read permission and indirect. We have different tables with execute permission, and we know, the different layout of those because Cynthia showed us that visual. We have code units. We have pages. So who would have guessed, if anyone in the audience knew that you would need all of these different permissions to be able to create a purchase invoice and assign a vendor, please let us know. But I've not come across anyone in the past who has.
And you have a job with us if you.
Right, exactly. So that's the permissions recorder. And keep in mind, like I said, you can always append to these recordings. So you can do multiple recordings that will just kind of add the missing permissions in that permission set if you need to.
And you can also manually modify them. So if you realize that you needed to just add a modify permission or insert permission to something and you're very aware of it, one of the rules that I place is if you're going through testing and someone gets an error and you just need to add insert permission, let's say, you can add that and have them try it again. What I do say is if you do that 3 times, it's time to record again. So number 2, less is more, but not in the way you may think. So what do I mean by less is more? Permission sets based on single tasks take less work to plan, record, and manage. So you might end up with more permission sets, but those permission sets will be very targeted and more reusable across multiple user groups if you focus on less tasks. The second one here, spread planning to include all functional areas. Now, this is where we were saying this is not an IT project, right? IT may be the project manager of it and coordinator of everything, but you need to get more people involved so that everyone will have a little less work to do and you'll have more accurate results. And an extra byproduct of this, and we can attest to this personally, those users that you get involved are going to be more understanding of what was involved to get this done, so that when they're testing or they're in production and they get an error that's a permission error, they're more understanding of what's happening and less frustrated. In fact, we actually had a recent situation where they were like, hey, I found another error. And they were looking at it as a good thing because they were finding it while they were testing. They were getting fairly far along because of the way we involved them with the recordings and setting up the permission sets. And they were actually excited that they caught something in testing before it got to production. And even if they caught something in production, again, they were understanding, much more understanding.
And sometimes too, I think it's like, oh, I forgot to do this additional step when I was recording. So yeah, it's exciting for them to realize like, oh, I'm
Right.
having this error message because I forgot to do something in the recording process.
So that even goes into the more time you spend on planning, the less likely that's going to be to happen, but it's still going to happen. And it's, again, interesting because they take ownership of it. I'm the one who forgot. It's not the IT department's fault that they didn't tell me to record this, right? They took ownership of it. So more time on planning, less time on errors. That's what we need to focus on next. And we can do that by even using a simple Excel tool where we keep track of all the information. In this one, I have this first worksheet. I have a list of all the roles that I'm going to be looking at as possibly being my user groups, but they're just the roles in my organization, what we call them. The next column would be where I'm going to indicate what profile or role they might be in Business Central. And then the third column is as I continue with my work, these would be the user groups that I would be assigning to individuals with this role in my organization. And this is the responsible person for my permissions project. This is that getting more people involved. The next thing I look at is master data. And this is a way for me to start honing in on what I might need to do for my permission sets. So for example, users, that's master data. And we think, oh yeah, IT department, they're the ones who create and maintain users. But guess what? The accounting department might need read writes because they need to provide information to the auditors. So don't assume, again, talk to the different department heads or the team members for your project planning and look at all of the master data, whether it's something like customers or it's sales documents or it's locations or it's dimensions, and determine who needs access. Then what we do is we start looking at each one of those areas. So here I have a tab for operations. And I'm going to look at focusing on the master data first and say, all right, vendor, location, item, customer, sales order. What do I need to do with those? What are the tasks that I perform related to that master data? And this is where Cari and we just came off of a large project where we sat down with the users and we just talked through what they did in their day and gave them a few examples and then handed them this worksheet and let them continue to fill it out. So after we figure out what all these tasks are, we determine who we're going to assign this to for the purpose of creating that permission set. And by the way, we're going to use that permission recorder. We want to go ahead and we can put in our notes, in this case, the way that they're going to edit customers is also going to be the same function that customer service is going to have. And if I look at customer support or customer service, you can see where I've indicated in this case with the first one that ops is going to need it. So ops is going to need one of the permission sets related to customers that customer support does, but not the other one. This is that example of smaller tasks. In this case, how I work with the customer is actually going to be in two separate permission sets. Now, other notes might be that why would ops need to delete orders? I'm Why? Because guess what? Orders get imported, ops reviews them, and they might need to delete them. So this is one of those examples where you might not think that a department needs some capabilities that you need to assign. So figure out what all those tasks are. Now look at what you're going to name those permission sets. You'll notice that we start all of these with NVS because the D365 came from Microsoft. NVS is for our company. So as I go through and create these permission set names, I want to determine some sort of convention. This is probably the hardest part of the planning. Don't you agree, Cari? Figuring out what to call the permission sets?
Yeah, definitely. And you do have a character limit too, so you got to make sure it fits within
Yes.
that character limit.
Exactly. So we're going to do this for operations. We're going to do this for customer support. We're going to do this with warehouse. And when we get these done, we're going to indicate that we've added them to user groups. But finally, we need to make sure that we indicate that we've tested them. So now you really have everything you need in this one worksheet, and it really makes it a lot easier. And it allows you to coordinate this group effort with this ownership and involvement of more people so that everyone has less work.
Very cool,
Third
Cynthia.
one.
All right. I'm going to try to top that, but I don't think I can. So don't forget to record working from the role center. And what I mean by this is kind of twofold. There are certain tasks that you can't find from Tell Me. So remember when I opened that permissions recorder, I said you don't close out of this because then your recording won't work. Well, what if you can't access the task you need through Tell Me? The other thing too is to make sure that the user has access to see everything on their role center with the assigned profile that they have. We like to recommend recording that role center, and I'm going to show you how to do that in this video. So I created a permission set called NVS Accountant, and this is just going to be permissions for the accountant role center. So I'm going to do what I normally do is go to permissions, and now normally I would start my permissions recorder and use Tell Me to find my task, but I can't use Tell Me to go back to my role center. So I'm going to use this little button to open the page in a new window, and that opens my permissions recorder in a new window. Now what I can do
Yay!
is I can go ahead and I can start my permissions recorder in that separate window. And I'll say yes. I go back to my original BC instance, and now I can exit back all the way to my role center. And for this recording, I'm just going to click on the company name, and this will essentially take me back to my role center. Now, when I'm done doing that, I'm going to go back to my other window that has the permissions recorder open, and I'm just going to do as I normally would. I'm going to stop and say, yes, I want to add the recorded permissions. And now if we look, this is essentially everything we need to be able to go into our role center to access this main data that's showing on our role center. And again, a lot of this you probably wouldn't realize you needed if you were just kind of manually going through and adding these permissions. So this is a way that the permissions recorder can help us kind of just to get access to the role center in general, to be able to get into our main page, and then also record any tasks that we cannot access through Tell Me.
And I will say that you can break this out into the other window, go back to the role center, and then hit start, or go to any integration or anything else that you need to record again that you can't get to through Tell Me.
Yes.
So this is really the tool for that. So,
and I think it it is that easy, but again, Cynthia and I spent, I don't know how long, not an extraordinary amount of time, but we spent time trying to figure out, well, how do we do this? How do we record something when we can't use Tell Me?
You know what, Cari? I even had someone say to me once, Cynthia, why do you share so much things that you've learned the hard way? It's kind of like you're admitting that you screwed up or you didn't know something. It's like, well, that's because I'm human, and if I don't share this, someone else is going to be frustrated and maybe not figure it out. So
exactly. we'll see, you know, in some of the future lessons learned that we have too, we really did learn things the hard way.
Yeah, definitely.
So this one, I'm going to start with a story. And the lesson that we've learned from this is don't let your extensions bite you in the butt. So Cynthia and I were working with a company, and what we kind of did was we decided, let's do our planning. Let's have one department, which we did customer support, start with the permissions recording. We'll have them kind of test all the way through before we even get started on the other departments. We want to make sure that our process is working. And so what we decided was, well, let's record the permissions and set up all the permission sets, permissions groups in the sandbox environment. So
And
normally when you're,
everything was going so well.
yes,
It was
so every,
great. It was wonderful.
it was great. And then we pushed the permissions into production to do a final walkthrough of testing. And at this point, we only had assigned them to one user because we know we
Yep.
want to make sure that before giving these permissions to everyone, we want one user to test for a couple days and make sure. And Cynthia, what happened when we put these into production?
I think it took 5 minutes before they got an error,
Yeah.
permission
So
error.
the reason for this is because they had a lot of extensions and other programs in their production environment that were not hooked up in Sandbox. So they specifically were using Avalara for tax. They were using Continua for AP. They also were using the D365 sales and customer service hubs for CRM management. And because these weren't in Sandbox, these permissions just did not get captured in the recordings. So what
Right.
we kind of
So
did to go ahead, Cynthia.
Well, I was just going to say, so what we have here on this slide is just a representation of what we're trying to refer to here. These ISVs or these marketplace apps, and even any of your customizations. So I don't care if it's Avalara and Continua, which we ran into. It could be Lanham Associates, InsightWorks. It could be I don't know, there's so many out there. So we're not saying it's just a problem with these. It's just that we need to make sure that wherever you're recording includes all of your integrations and everything.
Exactly. And so what we kind of did to mitigate this was we said, you know, normally we wouldn't do this, but we're going to have these users try to record in the production environment. And because the users were involved in that planning process and because they were just going about their job tasks throughout the day, they were actually able to kind of just go into the permissions recorder, click record, do a task as normal. So they weren't using dummy data. They were actually entering their transactions as they normally would and then doing the recordings while doing that. So it had minimal impact on their day as far as doing this. Now, we don't necessarily recommend for every permissions implementation that you're recording in production, but if you do have the case where there are marketplace apps and extensions or D365 additional apps that you're using in your production environment and not Sandbox, this could be a good approach to be able to kind of get around that. All
Excellent.
right.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
5, to give permission to post, we don't need to give permission to read GL entries. Well, what are we talking about and what do we have to do? Well, we only have to create 2 permission sets in one user group, but to do what? So the idea here is that I have a user that or users that need to be able to use GL accounts, select the GL account on a transaction line, but I don't want them to be able to see the balances or see any of the GL entries. So for example, I don't want that user to be able to come into the chart of accounts and to be able to see that I have $96,000 in my petty cash. I don't want them to be able to see all of the detail entries that make up that 96,000. Now, that's because I might have sensitive information. Petty cash might not be that, but what about salaries and payroll and some of the other entries that people just have no business seeing, but they work in accounts payable and I do post directly to GL accounts there. So how am I going to handle that? Well, before I do the work, I want to throw in a little bonus here, an extra. I can actually change my role or profile to administration of users and user groups. And what that does is that gives me a role center that is geared towards the admin for permissions. So even if you're doing this work maybe only as part of your job, you can always come into this particular role while you're doing the work. So we're going to go to permissions, and I'm going to show you here the permission set that I created. There's 2 of them, as I said. And the first one is the one that's the little secret to the sauce. And if I look at the permissions here, you'll notice that I'm giving permission to table data GL entry, and I'm giving them read permissions. And that's because indirect permissions won't work in this case. Because when we go to post, what happens is the system needs to have actual read permission whenever the GL entry number is 0. And that's because it uses this in the process of posting. Now, I'm not going to have a posted GL entry with zeros, so giving someone the ability to read a GL entry of 0 is not going to let them see anything in GL entries because of that filter, and that's the secret to the sauce. Now, the second permission set in the user group, I'm going to assign GL entry, and I'm giving indirect read and insert permissions. What we mean by indirect is that because the user will be given permission to post, they will indirectly have the ability to read and insert GL entries. They won't be able to click on the GL entries and see those. So I need to go to my user group, and in this case, I created one called NVS GL Post Only, and you'll see that to this user group, I added those two permission sets. Again, remember, user groups are collections of permission sets. So there's the permission sets that I've added, 1 and 2. Now, when this user who has this assigned to them goes to the chart of accounts, they'll see the chart of accounts, but they will no longer be able to see that 96,000 or any of the amounts in any of the columns. So to make that happen, I just make sure I go to that user and I assign that user group to the users that I want to only have that permission. And that's all there is to it. Now, little extra thing, I forgot. You might find that you want someone to be able to see the GL entries in one company, but not another. So don't forget these user group memberships when they get assigned. If you don't select a company name, they have access in all companies or that permission in all companies. And if you assign a company, it applies to that company.
Cynthia, I just have to say, as an accountant, I noticed that they had $96,000 in their petty cash account. So if that's petty to them, I think maybe they need to look at reclassifying that. But that's really cool. And I know that this is a request we get all the time. How do we allow our users to do their jobs but not give them access to sensitive information? So amazing. You've blown my mind. All right.
Well, good. I'm glad.
And I'm hard to impress. All right, let's keep moving along. So your security administrator must be a superhero. And notice that we put the super in quotations, and we'll kind of see why that is. Know that just having the security permission set or user group is not enough. So in this first example, you'll see this user has the user permission set of security, as well as D365 Business Premium, which gives access to essentially everything that that user has been licensed for in the environment. So you would think that the combination of these two would be enough to be able to assign or take away any permissions, but that's not the case. In this first kind of notification warning message, we see that what the permissions administrator was trying to do was take away the edit in Excel permission from a user, and they can't do that. And why is that? It's because they themselves do not have that permission. So it's saying you don't have the rights to manage permission sets that you don't have because security permission only grants you the rights to the permission sets that you also have. And it's the
Which
same.
it just seems so odd to me that that's what you have to do.
It is. And I remember the first time we came across this error message and I was just like, wow, you know, like that's something really interesting. So it was something that I think I shared with Cynthia, 9 months ago, and we were like, oh, we have to put this in the presentation because, we were both a little surprised. It's the same when you try to add that Excel export action user group. Because this security administrator does not have that permission set, they cannot add that to another user. So it's something just to kind of keep in mind. We have two options of how to kind of get around this. We can add super to that security administrator. So they have super in security. This will essentially allow them to add whatever they need. But as we talked about before, you don't necessarily want to add super. So what about if super is too much? What we want to do in this case is we want to make sure that that security administrator has all of the user-defined user groups and user permission sets that they will need to be assigning to other users. So in this case, you can see we have the user-defined user group of DynamicsCon users, which we created for today's session. And then they also have all of the user-defined permission sets, which Cynthia, kind of pointed out before. They start with NVS just because they're relevant to our company, and that's how we know that. They also then have that security in that purple box. So the combination of these will allow them to be able to successfully do their jobs and add these permissions.
And that means if we do this, we don't have to put the super user on them, right?
Exactly, yes. You'll notice that super is not anywhere in the permission sets.
Right. And one other thing that you can do with this approach, which is actually, to me, a byproduct of being forced to do this, is that you might have your department heads are allowed to do security for their team. So if you have high turnover, let's say in customer support, rather than IT have to be involved all the time, maybe your customer support manager is allowed to do security for their own users. So you would assign that customer support manager all of those user groups that they're allowed to manage the security of.
Yep, and it's just another reason to get your users involved in this planning and implementation process.
Right. Now, one of the things that can be a challenge is you have these different user groups and there may be overlapping permissions. So we had already submitted our session for 6. So we're throwing this in as a bonus rather than having it be 7. And we want to talk about using effective permissions. So just very quickly, what that allows us to do, and you can see here I'm back at that administration of users role center, is I can go into a user and right up at the top there, it says effective permissions. I click on that and what it does is it brings up all of the permissions by object. And I'm going to filter here on GL entry because we were talking about that, right? Where we said we wanted to give them permission to actually post but not read. So I happen to know that's table 17. You could do it by object ID, or if you know what the table name is or object name is, you can filter that way. And when I look down at the permission sets, it indicates down there that here are the permission sets that are granting permission to table 17 and what those permissions are. So in this case, I came in here because for some reason this user could still see the chart of accounts balances. Well, that's because guess what? They have super user here. This is one of those examples of maybe somebody put super temporarily on this user to get them through what they were doing and never came back and took it off. So that effective permissions is really, really helpful for you to be able to see what permissions are given through what permission sets and what user groups and what you need to do. Now, we also mentioned that we don't like to assign any permission sets directly to users, but what I will tell you here is this is a case where super, you don't want to bury super in any user groups. So if you need to assign super to somebody, assign it as the permission set so you can easily find it and you can remove it, or maybe limit their super access to only certain companies.
Cynthia, that was like 2 bonus tips. We just get so excited about permissions that we can't help sharing. All right, thank you so much, everyone. We can't wait to take a look at your questions and start interacting and get some of those questions answered. So make sure that you get it in chat right now if you have any other comments for us, or if you want to connect with us on LinkedIn or via email. These cool little QR codes here, you all know how to use them. Just go ahead, scan that with your phone camera, and you can add us on LinkedIn. We'd love to connect. Cynthia, any closing thoughts from you?
Yes, that big thank you up there is also for DynamicsCon. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to share this information so that other people don't have to go through the pain that we went through to get to the point where we could put this list together. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And we are here live for you today to answer your questions. Hello, everybody.
Hello. Thanks for being at our session. All right, Cynthia, we did have quite a few questions posted in the chat throughout, which is fantastic. And we're going to get as many answered as we can. I think we have about 9 minutes, we were told. So we kind of noticed a common theme with a lot of the questions, and it was around Business Central updates. So what happens when Business Central pushes new updates in? How do we accommodate for that or keep our permission sets from breaking? So Cynthia, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I can. And actually, there have been some comments also that were added related to that, that it definitely caused things to break.
Hmm.
And I'd be curious if it was more than permissions that broke too. So if it has something to do with maybe an extension or custom fields that were added and then those broke and then the permissions broke. So there might be some relationship there. However, generically, what I will say is if you are using the recordings and you find that what users were able to do, now you're in the sandbox, right? Because you're testing your upgrade or you're looking at the preview, and you find that the permissions are a problem, you should be able to allow that user, go ahead and assign them super user and allow them to re-record over top of the set that you're working with that's causing the problem, re-record the new activity or that activity in the new version. So for example, they're generating payment journal lines. You have a user permission set to allow a person to work with the payment journal. So you're going to go ahead and you're going to open up that permission set that allows them to work with the payment journal. And you're going to start recording the work that they're doing that was causing them the permission error after the update. Since they're super user, they won't get the error, and your recording will be updated and or appended based on the new information provided as they were recording that. So that's the answer. Now, what's interesting is we've done a couple of these projects and we have not been reached out to by our customers that we've used this approach, saying that since the update, and they did have some updates, obviously, since then, caused a problem. So maybe it's the users that are on this group, it sounds a little more prevalent. I don't know. What are your thoughts, Cari?
Well, one thing that I actually took away from what you said is just to reiterate, you don't necessarily have to start over with the recording. You just need to start at the point where the issue is happening or the error message is happening. So you don't need to start over. I've kind of had a similar experience to you. I can understand where if a new report was added or a new page, the posted general journal screen or something like that, I can definitely understand that that's something that might need to be appended to in the recording. But yeah, I would agree that I haven't seen too many things breaking as far as permission sets. But it's definitely a possibility.
Well, and then one of the other questions that came up just now that I think makes it sense to answer is there a quick way to view which permission sets contain a certain object type or ID? Absolutely. What you can do, the easiest way is to go into a user that is causing the issue or you want to see what's going on, or a user that's a good example, and use effective permissions. And what that does is that allows you to see a list of all of the objects. And when you select or highlight a row with one of the objects at the bottom, it will tell you what permission sets are and or entitlement gives them access and what the access is to that object. It also tells you whether there's conflicts. And also you can find out if you have, this is the reason that they can read this because this permission set is giving them read capabilities where the other one didn't.
Right. So I'm going to actually read another question just to keep us moving because we are limited on time. The question, I believe, was from Russell, and he said, would permissions for fraud be less important if BC had full, always on, and high performance logging of data changes with tools to identify anomalies? So, Cynthia, I'll take a stab at this one and then hand it over to you to see if you agree. But ideally, yes, this would be fantastic. But what comes to mind for me is the change log. And you do want to be careful of what changes you're tracking in your change log because you don't want to bog down your system too much and have just pages and pages of things to look through. So I do think that this could be a good option if you're kind of picking and choosing what you want to track changes on. But Cynthia, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thought is I think tracking changes is a good way to figure out after the fact who caused the fraud. Limiting permissions in the first place, it's like, okay, if I leave the vault open and I have a security camera, okay, I'll be able to see that Cari went in and took $1 million and left. But if it's locked in the first place, Cari can't get in there and steal the $1 million. So
And
I think you need both.
I'll be out of the country already with my $1 million, so
Yeah,
you won't be able
exactly.
to catch
So
me.
you need both. And it does have both. So we do have always on capabilities to track. But to Cari's point, you just got to be careful what you are tracking.
Right. So the next question was from Pablo, and I know we alluded to this one a little bit in one of our tips, but he asked, would this recording take place in a copy or support environment? And for the most part, we always recommend doing something in a sandbox environment first, testing it before you push anything into production. The only case that we kind of identified that you might want to do a recording for permissions in a production environment was if you have an extension that's in production that is not in your sandbox. So I would say that we would recommend doing it in a sandbox copy. But if you do have those kind of outliers of extensions that you need to record, you could try doing that in production as long as you have the proper controls around it.
Right. And to go one step further, if you made a copy of your production company in your production environment, that does give you a low risk location to do recordings.
Very true.
But one of the challenges might be that copied company still may not be integrated to some of your other solutions. So it may not go far enough for you to be able to run.
Or maybe
everything.
It's integrated with your production copies of those extensions. So.
Right, exactly. And that could be a big problem.
All right. So I do see, I think we have a couple minutes left. We have not gotten a warning yet. I do see we also had a few questions around kind of comparisons to easy security. So I cannot speak to easy security because I'm not familiar with that, but I can speak to Business Central and how that works. And one of the permissions questions on easy security, are you able to add an expiration date to permission sets similar to previous easy security?
No,
Cynthia, I think that we both
not
said
that I'm aware
that
of, not
no.
at this point.
Right. And there was another one, and I'm just looking for it. Oh, and then I think Greg had asked, and I think this question got answered, is it possible to create groups of permission sets like you could in old easy security for nav?
Yep.
And I think, we had that answered.
Lewis answered. Thank you, Lewis.
Yes.
User
thank you,
groups.
Lewis.
Correct. And then also, I think we've already answered this question, assigned permissions and couldn't find similar in BC. It was easy to find which permission set was included. Any idea where we can find what permission sets an object is included in? And again, that's where that effective permissions comes into play. So, just assign it to a user, and then you can see if there's any other permission sets that are covering that same object. Plus, there are some of those, there are some lists of associated from the main card on the user group that you can see like in a checkbox form. I don't know how to explain it, but go to the user group page and look along the top and you'll see some different presentations of data. And the same thing with the permission sets. It's not necessarily the list of the objects, but it's a way to see like users that have a permission set assigned to them, or objects that are permission sets that are assigned to user groups, that type of thing.
So we just got our 1 minute warning, so we're going to have to log off, but hopefully we got everyone's questions answered. If not, feel free to reach out to us directly. Thank you so much to DynamicsCon for hosting this wonderful event.
Absolutely. And thank you to everyone who attended, and all the names that I recognize and all the names that we don't. So thank you.
Bye, everyone.